Hello, everybody, and welcome to the final chapter of the Seven Songs of Merlin. I can't believe we've already read 2 books. That is very exciting. In the last chapter, Dagda revived Rhea and gave Merlin the elixir he needed to save his mom. And then they have been whooshed out of the other world and are on their way to save his mom. So, let's do chapter 35, A Wizard's Staff. The flash faded into darkness. The only light came from the sprinkling of stars overhead. I found myself still kneeling, with Rhea still sitting by my side. Yet jagged rocks and steep cliffs replaced the steaming mist. A circle of polished stones replaced the tree of soul. Not far away, the corpse of a huge fallen warrior lay still and silent. I took Rhea's hand. We're back at the well. Too true, too true, too true. The hunched figure of Bumblebee approached in the near darkness. I never thought you'd return, and I see you've brought back the body of... Rhea, she interrupted, alive and well. Bumblebee froze mid-step. Even in the dim light, I could see his eyes grow wider. Then, for a brief instant, his mouth and multiple chins turned upward, ever so slightly. It lasted only a fraction of a second, yet I felt certain that he had actually smiled. I turned my gaze toward the sky, searching for any sign at all of the moon, yet I could find nothing. Nothing at all. I bit my lip. If only I hadn't wasted those precious minutes with Rita Gower. Rhea suddenly pointed to a faint glimmer of light that had emerged from behind a cloud. Oh, Merlin! That's all that's left of the moon. It will be gone before dawn. I leaped to my feet. So will our mother, unless we can get to her first. But how? Rhea stood, facing the southern sky. Our Bassa is so far away. As if in answer, the entire ridge shook with a sudden tremor. Then came another, still stronger. Another. Another. Rocks tumbled down from the cliffs on both sides of us. I pulled my walking stick out of my belt and leaned on it for balance. Then my second sight perceived a new shape rising on the horizon. Like a swiftly growing hill, it blocked out the stars behind. Yet I knew at once that this was no hill. Shim! I shouted. We're over here! A moment later, the giant's immense form towered above the 3 of us. As his feet crushed against the loose rocks, he lowered a great hand. Quickly, Rhea and I climbed into his palm, followed reluctantly by Bumblebee. Beneath his bulbous nose, Shim grinned crookedly. I is gladly to see you. Seize us, moaned Bumblebee, his hands wringing his cape. He's come to seize us. And we're glad to see you, I replied, ignoring the gesture. How did you know we needed you? Asked Rhea. And where did you find us? And where to find us? Shim lifted his hand as he straightened himself. Though I tried to keep on my feet, I tumbled into the fleshy palm, barely missing the huddled form of Bumblebee. Rhea, for her part, sat down beside us with the grace of a landing swan. I is asleepily, dreamings of... The giant paused, pursing his enormous lips. I can't remembers. Anyway, the dream changes into a bird, a hawk, like the one who rides on your shoulder, except he is all whitely gray instead of brown. I cringed. I could feel the old pain between my shoulder blades and another one besides. Then this hawk screeches at me, so loudly I wakes up. Shim scrunched his nose. With the powerfully feeling that I needs to find you, and, most strangestly, a picture in my mind of where to go. Rhea smiled. Your dream was sent by Dagda. The giant's bushy eyebrows lifted. You are a loyal friend, Shim. Now take us to our Bassa. I glanced at the trace of the remaining moon. It seemed even fainter than just a moment before. A bracing wind swept over us, blowing against my tunic as if it were a sail, as Shim turned and started lumbering back across the hills of the Lost Lands. In 3 or 4 strides, he scaled slopes that had taken us hours to climb, his hairy feet scrunching on the rubble. No sooner had he reached a valley floor than he had nearly gained the next ridge. In minutes, a hint of smoke scented the air, and I knew he had reached the hollow of the sleeping dragon. As Shim veered south to cross the channel, sea fog swirled around us. His pink eyes gleamed. Didn't I tells you I hopes to make another crossing with you one daily? His laughter rolled across the waves that slapped against his legs. Certainly, definitely, absolutely. Yet none of us joined in his mirth. Bumblebee hugged his belly, muttering about the demise of a great jester. Rhea and I, meanwhile, studied the night sky, trying to keep track of the swiftly fading moon. By the sounds and smells that moved through the darkness, as well as the shifts in our boss's in Shim's strides, I could sense some of the changes in terrain. After emerging from the channel, he marched over the rising coastal plain and swiftly mounted the hills. Soon his steps shortened as the grade steepened. We moved higher into the snowy ridges near the city of Vargal. At one point I thought I heard deep voices chanting in the distance, though the sound quickly died away. The alpine air grew misty and damp as we descended into a maze of hills and swamps. Somewhere near, I knew, lay the crystal cave of the Grandalusa. Was the great spider there herself, curled up among the treasures of Thinkyra, or was she out prowling for wraiths and goblins to satisfy her limitless appetite? The crashing and snapping of limbs below announced our entry into Drima Wood. Rich, resiny smells tickled my nostrils. Immense shadows, some nearly as tall as the giant who bore us, pushed skyward. I couldn't help but recall Shim's ardent wish that he had confided in me so long ago, to be big as the highliest tree. His wish had been granted, to be sure. Sitting in the great palm, I stared all the harder at the dying moon, glimmering high above us, and I felt increasingly sure that my own deepest wish would not be granted. Just when I began to wonder whether I could still detect the moon at all, or whether I was only imagining its pale glow, a new shadow loomed before us. Taller and fuller than the rest, it stood all the grandeur of Dagda's tree of soul. Here at last rose Arbassa. In its immense branches, glowing like a star, sat the aerial cottage that had Ellen of the sapphire eyes. Shim bent low, placing his hand on the oak tree's burly roots. I grabbed my staff and leaped to the ground, followed closely by Rhea and a stumbling Bumblebee. With a shout of thanks, I turned to Arbassa, hoping that this time the tree would not resist allowing me to enter. At that instant, the enormous trunk made a low, grinding sound. The bark creased, cracked, and opened. I plunged through the doorway. Taking the stairs 2 at a time, I bounded upward, not even bothering to glance at the runes carved on the walls. As I burst through the curtain of leaves at the top of the stairwell, Ixtama, the large-eyed squirrel, shrieked. He whirled around, dropping a bowl of water on the floor. Then, seeing Rhea come in just behind me, he scampered over to her, chattering noisily. Ellen, her eyes closed, lay on the floor, just where we had left her. The same pine-scented pillow supported her head, while the same shimmering blanket covered her chest. Yet as I set down my staff and knelt by her side, I could tell that much had changed. Her once creamy cheeks looked whiter than drier bones. Her brows showed the furrows of prolonged suffering. She seemed much thinner, as wispy as the vanishing moon. I lay my head upon her chest, hoping to hear the beating of her heart, but heard nothing. I touched her cracked lips, hoping to feel the slightest breath of air, but felt nothing. Rhea crouched beside me, her face nearly as pale as our mother's. She watched, motionless, as I reached into my satchel and removed the vial containing the elixir. Touched by the light from the hearth, it flashed with brilliant red, the color of Dagda's own blood. The whole room flooded with scarlet hues. Barely able to breathe myself, I dropped the elixir into my mother's mouth. Please, Dagda, I beg of you, don't let it be too late. Don't let her die. I barely noticed when Ixtama whimpered, wrapping his bushy tail around Rhea's leg, or when Bumblebee entered the room, shaking his head morosely, or when the first faint rays of dawn touched the leaves draping the eastern windows. Yet I noticed with every particle of my being when my mother opened her eyes. Seeing Rhea and me, she cried out in surprise. Rosy hues flared in her cheeks. Drawing a tentative breath, she weakly lifted a hand toward each of us. We clasped her hands in our own, squeezing the living flesh. Tears brimmed in my eyes while Rhea sobbed quietly. My children. Rhea smiled through her tears. We're here now, Mother. Ellen's brow creased slightly. Forgive me, child, for not telling you before you left. I thought that if I died, your pain would be too great. You didn't have to tell me. Rhea touched the amulet of oak, ash, and thorn upon her chest. I already knew. I nudged her and grinned. Whatever this girl knows about instincts, she learned from me. We laughed, mother and daughter and son, as if all our years of separation had never occurred. For even if some day hence we might be forced to part again, right now a single, unalterable truth filled our hearts. On this dawning day, in the boughs of this great tree, we sat together, reunited at last. Only after much more laughter and much more talk did we pause to eat a hearty breakfast of Ixtama's honey-soaked nuts and rosemary tea with plenty of mint. And only after my fifth helping did I catch sight of the glittering object resting by the hearth, the flowering harp, its magical strings aglow, leaned against the wall of living wood. Suddenly I caught my breath. Behind the harp, several more objects lay stacked. Staring at them with amazement, I licked the honey from my fingers, pushed myself up from the floor, and stepped closer. I couldn't believe it, yet I knew it was true. All of the treasures of Thinkyra were here, right here in Rhea's cottage. There, gleaming darkly, sat the collar of dreams, the graceful horn that Cairpri had once told me could stir any dream into life. Beside it rested the double-edged sword Deeper Cut. When I had reached to touch its hilt, the powerful blade hanging on my belt rang softly, reminding me that my sword too had been wrought to fulfill a remarkable destiny. Next to the twining branches of the wall rested the fabled plough that could till its own field. Beside it stood the hoe that nurtures its own seeds, the saw that cuts only as much wood as is needed, and the rest of the wise tools, except of course the one that had been lost. I wondered for an instant what sort of tool it was, or where it might be now. Then my attention turned to the last of the objects, the orb of fire. The orange sphere glowed like a radiant torch, or, as Dagda had said, like a radiant spirit. The treasures, I said aloud, unable to turn away from them. Rhea, who had silently joined me, took my arm. Ixtama told me the Grandalusa brought them here, not long before we arrived. Hearing the squirrel chatter angrily, she grinned. He reminds me that she only brought them to the clearing outside our bassa, since she was too big to carry them inside herself. She asked, well, commanded, Ixtama and his family to do the rest. Perplexed, I ran my finger over the harp's oaken sound box. Dagda must have sent the Grandalusa a message, as he did Shim. But why? The treasures were safe enough where they were, in her crystal cave. She had agreed to guard them for all time. Not for all time, only until she could find someone wise enough to choose the right guardians to take care of them. The treasures, before Stangmar, belonged to all of Thinkyrians. The Grandalusa believes it should be that way again, and I agree. More confused than ever, I shook my head. But who is wise enough to choose the guardians? Surely the Grandalusa herself could do a better job than anyone else. Rhea observed me thoughtfully. That's not what she thinks. You don't mean. Yes, Merlin, she wants you to do it. As she told Ixtama, the Isle of Thinkyra holds a wizard once more. I swallowed, glancing again at the objects stacked by the wall. Each of them, regardless of shape or size or materials, possessed a magic that could enrich all of the inhabitants of Thinkyra. Rhea grinned at me. So what are you going to do? I really don't know. You must have some ideas. Bending down to the floor, I retrieved my staff, a wizard's staff. Well, I think the Collar of Dreams should go to Cairpri, wisest of the bards. I indicated Bumblebee, still stuffing himself with nuts and honey. And I think a certain humorless jester deserves the honor of delivering it to him. Her grin broadened into a smile. Warming to my task, I grasped the handle of the plough that tills its own field. I am not sure just yet about most of the wise tools, but this plough is different. I know a man named Han who will use it well, and share it gladly. Then I bent to retrieve the glowing orb of fire. I hefted it, feeling its pulsing warmth. Without a word, I handed it to Rhea, whose leafy garb danced with the orange light. Surprise filled her face. For me? For you. She started to protest, but I spoke first. Remember what Dagda told us? The orb of fire can rekindle hope, joy, and even the will to live. It belongs in the care of someone whose spirit shines as bright as it does. Her eyes glistened as she studied the sphere. You've given me something even more precious than this. For a long moment we held each other's gaze. At last she pointed to the flowering harp. Now what about that? I grinned. I think it ought to go to 2 people with a garden that flourished even in the middle of the rusted plains, when everything around it lay dying. Tilian and Garlatha? I nodded. And this time, when I carry the harp to their home, I'll expect nothing more than to be welcomed as their friend. Again I touched the oaken sound box. First, though, I will take the harp myself for a while. I have some unfinished work to do in the dark hills. As she lifted her gaze to our boss's arched brows, Ria's face glowed. Well, as it happens, so do I. Really? I raised an eyebrow. What work do you have there? Guiding. I have a brother, you see, who gets lost easily. Okay, well that is the end of the book. So tomorrow we have we have to start the new book. So I will find a way to get that and I will read it to you all. Have a wonderful night and thank you for joining me.